A single viral post would have shattered the carefully constructed worlds of Rock Hudson and John Wayne overnight. We're dissecting exactly which star's secrets, from hidden sexuality to shocking political statements, would trigger immediate cancellation, professional blacklisting, and global digital outrage today. Rock Hudson, the straightest star who couldn't be himself. Rock Hudson defined the American leading man, tall, handsome, and eternally masculine. But the studio system built his entire multi-million-dollar career on a lie that would be exposed, scrutinized, and destroyed by a single modern Twitter thread. In an era where a star's private life was considered as critical as his performance on screen, Rock Hudson carried perhaps the heaviest burden of all: the relentless, suffocating pressure of a meticulously manufactured persona. Born Roy Harold Shearer Jr., he was discovered by Hollywood agent Henry Wilson, who envisioned the ultimate fantasy, an embodiment of post-war masculinity. Wilson completely reinvented the star, renaming him Rock Hudson, teaching him how to walk, speak, and command attention. This process was predicated on one foundational demand: the absolute concealment of Hudson's homosexuality. Rock Hudson had to be the straightest star in the sky, a hero capable of sweeping Doris Day off her feet. The fear of being outed was a constant, crippling anxiety. The studio devoted vast resources to maintaining this elaborate deception. The most famous instance of this extreme control arrived in 1955, when Confidential magazine threatened an exposé. In a frantic deal brokered by Wilson, the magazine was paid off, and the studio orchestrated a highly publicized forced marriage to Phyllis Gates, Wilson's own secretary. It was a union designed purely for public relations, a desperate final attempt to put the question of his true preferences to rest. In the 1950s, the deception was fragile but maintainable. Today, the elaborate choreography of his double life would be a one-hour TikTok live stream. The sheer number of smartphones, the instant proliferation of images, and the global 24-hour news cycle of social media would have instantly and completely exposed his reality, leading to the immediate destruction of his persona and the multi-million-dollar brand built upon it. The emotional and psychological cost of maintaining the deception was incalculable. It required constant vigilance, isolating the star from genuine intimacy and forcing him to live in a perpetual state of fear. The man the world saw on screen was a perfectly engineered illusion, tragically confined by the expectations of an era that demanded rigid conformity. It is a chilling thought that the very lie that made him one of the biggest stars on the planet would, in the current climate of celebrity honesty and instant exposure, have resulted in his instant cancellation and professional undoing. The silence of the 1950s press may have protected his image, but it condemned the real Roy Fitzgerald to a lonely, hidden life. Judy Garland, the studio's substance-addicted child laborer. Before she was an icon, Judy Garland was a child worker, systematically given stimulants to stay awake and sedatives to sleep. We reveal the criminal charges MGM executives would face today for this industrialized abuse. The tragedy of Judy Garland began not on a stage, but in the private offices of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. As a young girl named Frances Gumm, she was signed to the studio, and instantly she was evaluated as a commodity, not a child. The greatest challenge for the studio was not her singing voice, which was magnificent, but her ability to sustain the grueling schedule of 20-hour workdays that the contract system demanded. They had a star to build, and childhood fatigue was an inconvenience they simply would not tolerate. To keep her awake for marathon filming sessions, often working through the night to meet a studio deadline, the physicians on MGM's payroll began administering stimulants, often euphemistically called pep pills. These were often taken alongside her co-stars, a disturbing normalization of dependency in the workplace. When the work was done and the child was exhausted and frantic, the cycle would reverse. She was then given sedatives, the sleepers, to ensure she rested quickly so she could be back on set the following morning. This constant, chemically driven oscillation fostered an immediate and lifelong dependency that was not accidental but studio-enforced. Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM, famously controlled the private lives of his stars, but with Judy, this control was tragically physiological. The contrast with today's legal and cultural climate is stark. In the golden age, there were minimal protections. Today, strict child child labor laws, like California's Coogan Law, regulate working hours, education, and finances for minors in entertainment. If a modern studio were found to be systematically administering to a minor to enforce 20-hour shifts, the result would be a massive, immediate scandal involving Child Protective Services, multiple criminal investigations, and civil lawsuits targeting every executive and physician involved. Mayer and the MGM physicians, who were seen as simply managing a valuable asset, would today face immediate professional disgrace and criminal charges related to child endangerment and the illegal provision of to a minor. The exploitation of Judy Garland, accepted in the 1930s as the price of fame, would be deemed an unforgivable act of immediate criminal child abuse indictment in the modern world. Judy Garland's life was a testament to survival, yet her journey began with a betrayal that started with a pill and ended with a crippling emotional toll. The yellow brick road led straight to the studio pharmacy, a path that modern justice would never allow a child to walk alone. John Wayne, the enduring legacy of toxic statements. For decades, John Wayne stood as the rugged, ultimate symbol of American masculinity and patriotism. In a world of instant feedback and boycotts, his candid, shocking political and statements would lead to the immediate of his entire brand. Born Marion Morrison, the man who became John Wayne was arguably the most powerful conservative icon in the history of Hollywood, embodying the spirit of the Wild West and the unwavering American hero. During the Golden Age, stars often held forth on their political views, but the structure of the press and the power of the studio machine typically provided a certain insulation. The public image was often kept separate from the private ideology, allowing audiences to remain wrapped in the fantasy of his on-screen bravery. In today's interconnected environment, that separation is unthinkable. The Duke's most infamous statements, which were published in a 1971 Playboy interview, would be instantly disseminated and amplified by every form of digital media. His comments included dismissive views toward the plight of minorities and concerning views regarding the history and culture of indigenous peoples. In 1971, he declared, "I don't feel we did wrong in taking this great country away from them." Such candid declarations would not only ignite a massive social media firestorm, but would trigger universal studio boycotts and institutional backlash. Within hours, there would be organized demands for streaming services to remove his films, for production companies to distance themselves from his name, and for his very image to be scrubbed from public life. The attempt to separate the artist from the person would be impossible, as his own words would become the permanent headline. In the 1970s, the controversy surrounding the Playboy article largely faded, shrugged off by many as simply the Duke being the Duke. This acceptance was a product of his untouchable status and the cultural climate of the time. Today, that cultural climate has been replaced by a fierce commitment to public accountability. The impossibility of separating the man from the image would mean that his entire brand, from the Western hero to the symbol of patriotism, would be universally tainted by the legacy of his ideology. The Duke's powerful cultural footprint, which once seemed indestructible, would crumble beneath the weight of his own deeply controversial words, leaving behind a career that could not possibly survive the current era of instant moral judgment and societal policing. If you thought Wayne's opinions were toxic, wait until you hear the criminal allegations against the screen's greatest swashbuckler. He walked free in 1942. Today, he wouldn't walk out of the courtroom. That's Errol Flynn next. Errol Flynn, the unacceptable lifestyle of the swashbuckler. He was the charming rogue who walked free from statutory charges in 1942. Today, Errol Flynn's documented lifestyle, use, and history with minors would ensure his immediate arrest, incarceration, and permanent Hollywood exile. No star embodied reckless abandon quite like Errol Flynn. On screen, he was Captain Blood and Robin Hood, leaping across decks and swinging through trees with dazzling charisma. Off-screen, that same reckless spirit translated into a private life of chaotic indulgence that the studios remarkably were willing to tolerate and often even cover up. His behavior was frequently described by the press as simply a wild streak, a testament to his captivating charm and box office power. The truth was far darker. Flynn's personal lifestyle was defined by rampant alcoholism and abuse. His dependency was so severe that accounts of his daily consumption of alcohol and painkillers are staggering.
often leading to volatile and unreliable behavior on set. The studios, particularly Warner Brothers, viewed his stability as a production risk. But instead of demanding intervention or rehabilitation, they focused on minimizing public awareness, using their publicity machine to generate charming anecdotes instead of calling for medical help. Yet the indiscretions that would truly erase him today revolve around the legal age of consent. Flynn was a defendant in the infamous 1942 statutory charges, often sensationalized by the press as the rape case. The allegations centered on relationships with two girls who were under the legal age. While Flynn was ultimately acquitted in the highly publicized trials, an outcome influenced heavily by his star power and the cultural environment of the era. The documented evidence and public testimonies were devastating. In the 1940s, the studio was able to influence the narrative, and the general public proved largely willing to forgive their charming hero. But in the current climate, with its zero-tolerance policies and instant dissemination of information, this would be an inescapable public and legal disaster. Modern legal action would be swift and unforgiving. The sheer volume of photographic evidence, eyewitness accounts, and the swift flow of information via smartphones and social media would leave no room for cover-up or narrative spin. The criminal liability and ensuing public shame would not only result in his immediate career, but also his likely incarceration. The world has moved beyond dismissing the exploitation of minors as mere swashbuckling, and the industry's tolerance for his severe dependency would be seen as profound professional and ethical negligence. The next chapter focuses on a stunning actress whose natural identity was deemed unmarketable by the studio chief, leading to a painful, coerced
transformation that would provoke outrage today. Rita Hayworth, the forced transformation and body coercion. Hollywood decided she wasn't American enough. To create Rita Hayworth, the studio forced a young Margarita Cancino through years of painful electrolysis, chemically erasing her heritage. We call out the coercive medical violation that would bankrupt the studio today. The actress who would become the love goddess was born Margarita Carmen Cancino, the daughter of a Spanish dancer and an Irish-American mother. When Hollywood took notice, the studio chief, Harry Cohn of Columbia Pictures, saw a star who needed to be thoroughly remodeled to fit the prevailing, narrow definition of American beauty. Cohn's vision was absolute. Margarita Cancino would not be marketable in the 1930s and 40s. Her dark hair, darker complexion, and lower hairline, all features that spoke to her heritage, were deemed too ethnic for leading romantic roles. Cohn demanded a complete physical overhaul, essentially forcing the young woman to erase her own identity to become his marketable invention. The transformation was deliberate, agonizing, and prolonged. First, she was forced to change her name to the more anglicized Rita Hayworth. Next, her naturally dark hair was bleached a vibrant red. Most distressing, however, was the painful electrolysis process. Cohn insisted on a forced, years-long electrolysis process, chemically burning the follicles to raise her hairline. It was a painful mandate to literally erase her Hispanic identity because the studio decided she wasn't American enough. Today, this systematic, coercive process would ignite a firestorm of controversy. The modern discussion of identity politics, body autonomy, and cultural acceptance would transform this studio mandate into a massive public scandal. Harry Cohn would be universally called out for prejudicial practices and physical coercion. Columbia Pictures would face intense scrutiny, protests from advocacy groups, and demands for official apologies and reparations for forcing a star to undergo procedures that fundamentally altered her ethnic appearance. Rita Hayworth later confessed to hating the invention, stating that men went to bed with the beautiful Rita and woke up with Margarita. This profound sense of alienation from her own image was a direct consequence of Cohn's demands. The industry's failure to embrace her natural self and its decision to force her into a painful, predetermined mold stands as one of the most tragic examples of a star being systematically annihilated in the process of becoming famous. The physical transformation of Rita Hayworth concludes our first block of lies and coercion. Before we turn to the second act of systemic weaponization, if you're finding this deep dive into Hollywood's darkest secrets compelling, hit subscribe now. We have 5 more icons whose fate today would be far more immediate. Frances Farmer, the weaponization of mental illness. She simply refused to be a compliant Hollywood starlet. For that defiance, Frances Farmer was branded difficult, legally stripped of her rights, and committed to an asylum. We detail the patient rights lawsuits her family and studio would face for this legal imprisonment today. Frances Farmer arrived in Hollywood in the 1930s as an intellectual, nonconformist with a strong, independent streak, a disposition the studio system could not abide. Paramount Pictures had signed her, intending to mold her into a conventional, compliant starlet, but Frances refused to be contained. She disdained the social functions, resisted the vapid scripts, and demanded the artistic integrity of a serious stage actress. Her unwillingness to conform to the carefully crafted good girl image was immediately labeled difficult and uncooperative by studio executives. This resistance became her professional undoing. When she pushed back, Hollywood pushed back harder, eventually curtailing her opportunities and casting her in roles far below her talent. As her professional career stalled and her personal life became volatile, her emotional struggles escalated. This fragility, which should have been met with compassion and medical support, was instead seized upon by those who wished to control her, most notably her overbearing mother Lillian. Following a series of highly publicized legal incidents, a process was initiated to strip Frances of her autonomy. The emotional distress and instability she exhibited, symptoms we would recognize today as demanding urgent mental health care, were instead used as legal grounds to declare her incompetent. Her mother played a central role in committing her to a series of state institutions, initiating a traumatic decade of forced confinement. The woman who dared to challenge the studio was legally silenced, betrayed by her own family. In the modern context, where mental health advocacy and patient rights are paramount, this level of coercion would be unthinkable. The ease with which a woman who challenged the establishment could be legally silenced and confined, with the tacit approval of the industry that created her, would spark an immediate and massive public outcry. Today, advocacy groups would rally against the betrayal by the industry she challenged, demanding accountability for the family and legal professionals who facilitated her loss of freedom. The story of Frances Farmer is a painful reminder that in old Hollywood, the greatest danger to a non-conforming star was not necessarily professional failure, but the systematic and legal weaponization of their own psychological distress. Lana Turner, the teenager, the mobster, and the 24/7 trial. Lana Turner's private turmoil resulted in her daughter being raised in a crisis zone. Today, her unstable home environment would be seen as a clear case of child endangerment, leading to immediate custody intervention by the state. The glamour of Lana Turner was built on an image of desirable high society romance. Yet her private world was marked by an endless succession of turbulent relationships, revolving door marriages, and highly publicized emotional distress. While this chaos provided endless fodder for the fan magazines, it created an intensely unstable environment for her only child, Cheryl Crane. In the 1940s and 50s, the expectations of motherhood in Hollywood were often performative. Stars were expected to pose for wholesome photographs, but behind the scenes, the demands of the studio system and the financial pressures of maintaining a celebrity lifestyle meant that parenting was frequently delegated or conducted under chaotic circumstances. Lana Turner's lifestyle, dominated by emotional turmoil and the constant presence of powerful, often volatile men, meant her daughter was raised in a perpetual state of flux. The tragic 1958 incident, where teenage Cheryl fatally wounded Turner's boyfriend, Johnny Stompanato, brought the full extent of this instability into the unforgiving public spotlight. While the court ruled the fatal injury justifiable, the entire event exposed the vulnerable and terrifying domestic conditions under which the young girl had been living. The focus then was largely on Lana Turner's dramatic courtroom appearance. The focus on the welfare of the child was surprisingly muted. Today, the response would be entirely different. The modern legal and social framework prioritizes the protection of minors above the privacy of the celebrity. Any child exposed to such sustained emotional instability, domestic violence, and a violent family incident would immediately trigger a response from Child Protective Services and social workers. The media coverage, instead of glorifying the dramatic mother, would become a relentless scrutiny of the parenting environment. There would be intense public pressure to remove the child from the unstable home, leading to custody battles and mandatory psychological evaluations for all parties involved. Lana Turner's lifestyle would be deemed not merely colorful or dramatic, but a clear case of child endangerment that the modern state would be obligated to rectify. The lack of intervention, then, is a stark reminder of the power afforded to the studio machine and the celebrity status of the era. Lana Turner may have been the queen of Hollywood, but in the modern era, even royalty is subject to the unforgiving scrutiny of child welfare. The unstable home life of Lana Turner and her daughter was tragically brought to the fore. Our next chapter focuses on a sensitive actor whose decline was viewed not as a tragedy to be hidden, but as a spectacle to be exploited by the press. Montgomery Clift, The Closet, The Crash, and The Cover-Up. After a horrific 1956 car crash disfigured his face, the studio forced Montgomery Clift to conceal his physical trauma and his sexuality. Today, this exploitation would be exposed as a violation of LGBTQ+ rights and disability rights, crushing the studio responsible. Montgomery Clift represented a new kind of leading man in the 1950s, moody, deeply sensitive, and profoundly insecure. However, behind the captivating facade, Clift was waging a continuous, exhausting battle to conceal his homosexuality in an industry actively hostile to anything that deviated from the heterosexual ideal. The studio system placed immense pressure on him to uphold the image of a straight romantic hero. His agents and managers controlled his public appearances, ensuring he was never seen in circumstances that could compromise the lucrative fiction. This forced concealment, or forced closeting, was a severe psychological burden. Then came the event that irrevocably shattered both his image and his peace: the 1956 car crash. Clift slammed his vehicle into a pole, and his face, his most iconic asset, was severely damaged. The subsequent behavior of the studios was an act of profound exploitation. Instead of offering comprehensive medical and mental rehabilitation, they carefully edited his post-crash films, strategically lighting him to hide the trauma, prioritizing a perfect face over a struggling human being. The press, meanwhile, relentlessly pursued him, focusing on his visible injuries and his subsequent descent into substance abuse, used to manage the physical and emotional pain. Today, this entire sequence of events would be recognized not as tragic gossip, but as a severe case of institutional neglect and exploitation of disability and trauma. The modern conversation surrounding LGBTQ+ rights would rally around his forced closeting, condemning the studio that demanded he sacrifice his authentic self for their profit. Furthermore, the media's relentless focus on his physical and mental decline would spark massive public outcry over the lack of mental health support provided to a struggling artist. Montgomery Clift's final decade was a heartbreaking struggle for dignity under the spotlight. His story would become a powerful case study demonstrating how Hollywood prioritized the protection of a lucrative, false image over the well-being of the sensitive, struggling human being beneath it. Dorothy Dandridge, the black star who was still only offered maid roles. Despite an Oscar nomination, Dorothy Dandridge was only offered maid roles. We detail how the systemic racial quotas she faced limited her earning potential by 80%, exposing the institutional prejudice that would ignite modern social justice campaigns. Dorothy Dandridge was a stunning, undeniable pioneer. Her breathtaking performance in the 1954 film Carmen Jones earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress, making her the first black actress ever to achieve such an honor. That moment promised a crossover career that should have launched her into the highest echelon
of Hollywood stardom. The reality? The industry could not fathom a black woman as a romantic lead. Instead of complex parts, Dandridge was predominantly offered the same parts she tried to escape: maids and servants. This refusal to integrate her fully into its leading ranks became her professional undoing, shattering the promise against the rigid, unforgiving wall of institutional prejudice. The devastating lack of suitable follow-up roles led to her professional undoing. She often refused the servant parts, understanding that accepting them would undermine the very breakthrough she had achieved. This principled stand, coupled with the systemic failure of the studios to provide appropriate scripts, led to her career stalling. In the Golden Age, This institutional barrier was often accepted. Today, however, Dandridge's lack of opportunities would generate a massive public outcry. The immediate and universal accessibility of social media would quickly highlight the unforgivable failure of the studio system to capitalize on her talent. Modern activist groups would launch global campaigns demanding corporate accountability, demanding to know why a star of her magnitude was deliberately excluded from meaningful, high-paying work. There would be immediate pressure on studio boards to mandate diverse hiring in executive and casting roles, transforming her personal struggle into a social justice mandate. Dorothy Dandridge's story is a tragic monument to the systemic barrier of prejudice that was woven into the fabric of classic Hollywood. She had the talent to reach the stars, but the system had built a ceiling that she, alone, could not break. Mae West, the censor's target. Who'd face a modern moral panic? Mae West was a revolutionary, writing and directing her own scripts. But the male power structure decided she was too powerful, resulting in her slow, quiet, professional destruction. Today, she'd be hailed as a feminist auteur and protected by studio equity mandates. No star was more definitely self-made than Mae West. She strutted onto the screen as a force of nature, a hurricane of innuendo and unmistakable confidence. Famous for lines like, "Is that a gun in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me?" She became one of the highest-paid women in the country, single-handedly saving Paramount Pictures from bankruptcy. But her strength lay not just in her star power, but in her unprecedented creative control. She was one of the only women in Hollywood who was a true auteur, writing or co-writing her scripts, crafting her dialogue, and meticulously controlling her image. This autonomy was, in the end, deemed too powerful by the conservative forces of the era. As her popularity soared, so did the alarm bells from moral watchdogs. Mae West's brand of humor, which openly celebrated unconventional living and unapologetic female agency, became the primary target of the newly enforced Hays Code censorship. This was not merely about editing a few lines. It was a systemic campaign to neutralize her threat to traditional American morality. Censors demanded the elimination of her most characteristic jokes and dialogue, effectively neutering her comedy. Films were stripped of their vitality, and her ability to push boundaries was crushed. She was, in essence, professionally silenced, because her brand of comedy was seen as too independent, too powerful, and ultimately too dangerous to be a star. In the 1930s and 40s, the outrage was framed around obscenity and immorality. Today, she would be celebrated as a pioneering feminist auteur. Her fight for script control would be a foundational element of film history courses, and her celebrity would be amplified by female directors and writers who now demand the same creative autonomy she fought for. The studio's systematic attempt to silence her would be a cautionary tale of corporate and institutional prejudice against female empowerment. Before we start the final heartbreaking block on financial, medical, and ethical exploitation, we want to know, which of these stars, from the chemically abused Judy Garland to the censored Mae West, would face the most immediate disavowal by today's unforgiving media? Drop your answer in the comments below. Rock Hudson, the final silence of the AIDS crisis. When the truth finally came out, it was a terminal diagnosis. We reveal the human rights scandal created by his handlers, who tried to keep his AIDS diagnosis a secret, exposing the ethical and public health outrage that would destroy their careers today. In the 1980s, after decades of maintaining the perfect, straight, leading man facade, Rock Hudson's health began a dramatic, visible decline. His weight loss was noticeable, and his appearances were strained. The truth, however, was a profound tragedy. Rock Hudson was battling acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS, a new and terrifying epidemic that was, at the time, shrouded in fear, ignorance, and prejudice. The ensuing effort to keep his diagnosis a secret was a desperate and ultimately futile act of the old Hollywood machine trying to contain a modern disaster. His handlers and close associates engaged in a frantic, coordinated effort to shield the truth from the press, even as he was traveling internationally for specialized treatment. The public relations team continued to release carefully crafted statements, minimizing the severity of his condition. This calculated silence was born of two deeply ingrained Golden Age instincts. First, the instinct to control the narrative and protect the star's profitable image. And second, the profound fear and prejudice surrounding AIDS at the time, particularly given its strong, tragic association with the LGBTQ+ community. The studio mentality was that a star with this particular ailment was commercially radioactive. In today's world, the attempts by his handlers to keep his AIDS diagnosis
silent would not be a scandal, but a global human rights and public health crisis. The ethical implications of his inner circle, and the industry by extension, concealing information about a star battling a communicable disease would provoke massive institutional backlash and criminal inquiry. Hudson's final moments, when the truth was finally revealed, were a tragic confluence of the personal and the public. While he was sadly lost to the ailment, his admission forced a much-needed public conversation about AIDS, transforming the disease from a whispered epidemic into a national health crisis. Judy Garland, the tragic financial exploitation. Judy Garland passed away nearly bankrupt. Today, her financial ruin would trigger an IRS investigation and a $100 million class action lawsuit against MGM for predatory accounting practices. The cruel paradox of Judy Garland's career is that a performer who generated hundreds of millions of dollars for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer often found herself barely able to pay her own bills. This financial insecurity was not the result of irresponsible spending alone. It was a devastating byproduct of the structural exploitation woven into the fabric of the studio system and compounded by predatory financial management. From her earliest days, Garland was paid a mere fraction of the true value she generated. Studio accounting practices were notoriously opaque, designed to benefit the corporation and keep the talent dependent. As she transitioned to adulthood, her affairs were often placed in the hands of managers whose loyalty was questionable, leading to massive tax liens and financial fraud. This created a relentless cycle where the star was always earning a fortune, but always in profound debt or financial difficulty. The final insult came from the unforgiving hand of the American government. The enormous, erratic income from her early career was met with massive tax burdens, which, combined with negligent financial guidance, led to persistent, crippling tax liens and demands from the Internal Revenue Service. In the modern context, this financial destruction would be a major corporate scandal. Today, modern labor laws and industry watchdogs would quickly investigate the trail of mismanagement, predatory contracts, and studio accounting tricks that plagued her career. The public expectation for transparency and accountability would lead to lawsuits demanding the complete exposure of her contracts with MGM. The idea that a talent of her magnitude could die financially distressed would provoke massive public outrage, leading to calls for legislative reform to protect artists from such extreme financial predation. Judy Garland's tragic financial life reveals that in old Hollywood, true wealth was reserved for the studio executives who ran the machine, while the stars themselves were often little more than extravagant, disposable employees. John Wayne, the old guard's workplace behavior. John Wayne ruled his sets with absolute power. Today, his documented temper, political demands, and on-set intimidation would be a clear violation of HR policy, resulting in immediate termination and a hostile work environment lawsuit. The set of a John Wayne picture was a kingdom where he was the undisputed king. He commanded a degree of personal deference that is simply unimaginable in the contemporary film industry. The assumption was that his star power and box office appeal entitled him to a level of conduct that today would be described as volatile and unacceptable. Anecdotes from his career frequently describe a man whose temper could flare without warning, whose expectations of his crew were absolute, and whose political and personal opinions often dictated the entire workplace environment.
He was known to pressure younger actors to align with his conservative ideology and to be dismissive of those who failed to meet his definition of professional toughness or patriotism. This was a form of unquestioned authority, where dissent was professionally dangerous. In the Golden Age, this behavior was often tolerated, even romanticized, as the eccentricity of a powerful genius. The studio system provided a shield of silence, ensuring that the details of an on-set outburst never reached a formal human resources department. Compare that to the modern workplace environment. Today, every major studio operates with strict zero-tolerance policies concerning harassment and intimidation. The Duke's historically documented temper, his volatile conduct, and his political pressure on set would result in his immediate firing and a permanent professional blacklisting for violating modern standards of workplace conduct. The advent of social media means that a disgruntled crew member could instantly document and broadcast a tirade to a global audience. The resulting backlash would be immediate and severe. No studio would risk the liability, and no film would survive the intense public scrutiny. The behavior that once solidified his reputation as a tough guy who ruled his domain would today result in his immediate firing from the project. The assumption that star power grants immunity has been utterly dismantled. Errol Flynn, when substance abuse was a punchline, not a crisis. Errol Flynn's daily debilitating substance abuse was laughed off as charm. Today, his chronic dependency would be treated as a public health crisis, forcing the studio to face corporate negligence charges for failing to mandate rehab. The legend of Errol Flynn was intricately linked to his reputation for a wild, hedonistic existence. His excessive drinking and continuous use of controlled substances became part of the cinematic folklore, recounted in press reports with a kind of nostalgic indulgence. However, behind the amusing anecdotes lay a severe, life-consuming problem. Documented accounts from film sets detail his daily consumption of both alcohol and various forms of controlled substances. This not only affected his professional reliability, leading to delays, missed days, and volatile moods, but also rapidly eroded his physical and mental health. In the 1940s and 50s, the film industry's response to this devastating dependency was one of complete neglect and cover-up. There was no concept of a professional intervention, no mandated leave for rehabilitation, and certainly no public discussion of mental health or addiction as a legitimate ailment. The studio's only concern was ensuring the star was functional enough to complete the film, and when he wasn't, the focus was on silencing the incident. The modern landscape is a world away from this callous indifference. Today, an actor exhibiting Flynn's documented level of chemical dependency would be placed on a mandatory, immediate leave of absence. There would be a swift, collective call for rehabilitation, with resources dedicated to treating the underlying causes of his pain. Furthermore, the press would no longer treat his addiction as a colorful punchline. It would be framed as a serious public health crisis, drawing attention to the systemic failure of his professional environment. The industry's past acceptance of his chaotic lifestyle would be seen as an act of profound professional and ethical negligence. These stars faced unimaginable pressures, from forced deception to career-ending scandals. If you found the tragic truths of Rock Hudson, Judy Garland, or Errol Flynn compelling, please share this video with fellow classic film enthusiasts. Rita Hayworth, the late career mental health stigma. When Rita Hayworth started struggling, Hollywood called her a diva and an alcoholic. We detail the medical evidence proving this was the onset of Alzheimer's disease and the negligence lawsuit the industry would face today for their cruel misdiagnosis. In her later career, when Rita Hayworth struggled with confusion and volatility, the industry and the press dismissed it as diva behavior. Today, this neglect would be a scandal, as we now know those symptoms were the first tragic signs of Alzheimer's disease. By the 1960s and 70s, the glamour of Rita Hayworth had begun to fade, replaced by a painful public struggle. She frequently exhibited erratic behavior on film sets, forgetting lines, becoming easily agitated, and exhibiting unpredictable moods and confusion. Her struggles were met with cynicism and professional dismissal. She was branded as difficult, unprofessional, or the classic diva behavior archetype. Her
Her struggles were not met with medical consultation or gentle inquiry, but with cynicism and professional dismissal. Her confusion became fodder for gossip columns, not a call for assistance. It was not until 1980, tragically late in her life, that her symptoms were correctly identified. Rita Hayworth was suffering from the early onset of Alzheimer's disease. In today's environment, this level of
Institutional negligence would spark an immense, industry-wide scandal. If a star were exhibiting such clear signs of cognitive decline today, the immediate expectation would be for her agents, producers, and the studio to intervene with comprehensive medical and psychological support. The press's decision to weaponize her illness and label it as a personal failing would be seen as a profound ethical breach. The public outcry would demand that the industry face accountability for their failure to protect a beloved figure when she was most vulnerable. Dorothy Dandridge, The Black Tax and Bad Management. Dorothy Dandridge passed away ruined, crushed by financial predators and the cost of caring for her disabled daughter. This is the ultimate example of the black tax, and today, her tragedy would ignite a national social justice mandate for industry-wide reparations. The tragedy of Dorothy Dandridge was not a lack of talent, but the immense financial and personal burden placed upon her because of the systemic prejudice she faced. After her groundbreaking Oscar nomination, the lack of suitable, leading roles meant she struggled to maintain consistent, high-paying work. This professional stagnation created immense financial vulnerability. This vulnerability was compounded by devastating personal circumstances. Dandridge was the primary caregiver for her daughter Harriel, who had severe developmental disabilities and required specialized, expensive institutional care. The high cost of this care put a relentless strain on Dandridge's finances. Facing a combination of limited opportunities and urgent expenses, Dandridge fell victim to untrustworthy managers and financial advisors who misappropriated funds and guided her into disastrous business deals. Her struggle highlights what is now commonly referred to as the black tax, the phenomenon where marginalized artists must work twice as hard for half the reward and are often targeted by financial predators due to their lack of institutional protection. In the modern context, Dandridge's financial destruction would be a major social justice and legal mandate. The public demand for equity and accountability would spark widespread legal campaigns against the financial professionals who exploited her. Advocacy groups would highlight the systemic failures that simultaneously limited her earning potential due to prejudice and then allowed her to be financially ruined. The immediate reaction today would be to protect her assets, launch a comprehensive fraud investigation, and establish a secure, protected fund for her daughter's care. Her story would be used to lobby for stronger legal protections and financial literacy programs for minority artists. Mae West, the writer who couldn't keep control. Mae West was a revolutionary, writing and directing her own scripts. But the male power structure decided she was too powerful, resulting in her slow, quiet, professional destruction. Today, she'd be hailed as a feminist auteur and protected by studio equity mandates. No star was more definitely self-made than Mae West. Her strength lay not just in her star power, but in her unprecedented creative control. She was one of the only women in Hollywood who was a true auteur, writing or co-writing her scripts, crafting her dialogue, and meticulously controlling her image. This level of autonomy was nothing short of revolutionary in the 1930s, making her an entrepreneurial giant who threatened the male power structure of the studios. For a brief, dazzling period, her power was protected by her immense profitability. But once the profitability stabilized, the powers that be decided her control and her challenging themes had become a liability that needed to be neutralized. The principal tool used against her was the increasingly rigid Hays Code and the efforts of Joseph Breen, the chief censor. The censors systematically stripped her scripts of the very elements that made her popular: the double entendre, the knowing glance, the celebration of adult independence. This wasn't censorship, it was a form of professional, forced retirement. The resulting films lacked the subversive energy and sparkle of her early work, causing her box office appeal to inevitably wane. The message was clear: a woman could not be both a successful, powerful auteur
and a challenge to traditional morality. The studio system, realizing they could no longer control her voice, simply forced her into a position where she could no longer produce compelling work. By the early 1940s, Mae West left the screen. The Hollywood system had accomplished its goal of removing a creative force who was deemed too strong and too threatening to be permitted to hold the reins of her own success. Today, Mae West would be celebrated as a pioneering feminist auteur. Her fight for script control would be a foundational element of film history courses, and her celebrity would be amplified by female directors and writers who now demand the same creative autonomy she fought for. The studio's systematic attempt to silence her would be a cautionary tale of corporate and institutional prejudice against female empowerment. The stories of Rock Hudson, Judy Garland, John Wayne, and the rest show that the most beautiful star images were often built on the most painful lies. The stories of these 10 icons, from the forced closet of Rock Hudson and the criminal exploitation of Judy Garland, to the political toxicity of John Wayne and the institutional prejudice faced by Dorothy Dandridge, show that the beautiful, gilded images of old Hollywood were built on deeply painful, unforgivable lies. The standards of yesterday would lead to instant arrests, civil lawsuits, and universal boycotts today. If you found this deep dive into Hollywood's darkest secrets compelling, make sure to hit subscribe and give this video a like to help us keep shining a light on untold history.